Okay, we're already running just a little late, so I thought I would go ahead and get us started. Welcome to the 2:45 session of the iSEE Congress. We've had a lot of great talks today. My name is Amy Ando. I'm a professor of environmental economics in the Department of Ag and Consumer Economics here at the University of Illinois, and it is my privilege to moderate this session. We have 4 speakers instead of 3, but each of them will have 20 minutes. And we're starting today with Professor Ali Akanda. He is an assistant professor, move my notes here, of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Rhode Island. He got his PhD from Tufts in Massachusetts. There's going to be a theme here a little bit. And had an NIH predoctoral fellowship while he was there, and has worked as a research scientist at the University of Washington and as a software engineer, a little bit of real-world experience. His work focuses on early warning systems to benefit emerging water security and public health issues in the developing world, and I think we see that in today's talk, the Climate Water Health Nexus in the world's largest cholera endemic megacity. Come and take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. Very honored to be here, and thanks to the organizers for extending the invitation. You can see I probably have the longest title in the whole Congress here. But I wanted to also thank my parents for giving me names starting with A for both the first and the last name. That gives you the first spot in the bio. So with that, I'll start talking on this largest cholera endemic megacity. And everyone, there were a lot of titles with the phrase energy, food, and water nexus. So I thought I would throw mine out there, the climate, water, health nexus. And what I'm looking at is essentially how water resources and the hydrology of some of the regions are playing a huge role on waterborne diseases and other societal issues, and how climate change and hydrology is playing a role into it. Let's see, I haven't yet revealed which city is that. First, let me give you a brief overview on the global challenge on water and health. So many of you are familiar with these numbers, that over 1 billion people lack access to safe water and over 2.5 billion lack access to safe sanitation. So this has a tremendous impact on public health all over the world, especially in the developing world where this talk is focused on. The graphic on the right, it's from the WHO, and they have not come up with an updated graphic since 2004, but I'm sure that hasn't improved. If at all, it must have actually gone worse. But if you add up those numbers, that's 2.4 billion right there, and the world's population is 7 billion. So we are having every year about over 2 billion people, 2 billion children getting affected by diarrhea due to waterborne diseases mostly. And that has a tremendous impact on their growth, their well-being, and future development. So the thing that comes out from all these different UN policy and other documents is that the idea of an early warning system or a climate resilient water and sanitation infrastructure systems, which we are very familiar with, it does not resonate with them in the same way, and somehow we are just scratching the surface on these topics. And that's where I'm trying to explore where our expertise could help the public health people. Cholera is just one of the diarrheal diseases, but it is called a signature waterborne disease. It is affecting almost the entire developing world, and the world has seen many pandemics of this disease since the 1850s. Even this country had cholera about 100 years ago, but now that we have almost perfect water and sanitation, we don't have that anymore. But what it is, I just wanted to throw a brief overview out there that it is a very acute diarrheal infection, and people lose a lot of bodily fluids. And if it is untreated for a day or two, it can be fatal. And unfortunately, because of that, children under 5 is very vulnerable, because most times the parents do not even realize that they're actually having cholera. And the causative agent, the V. cholerae, it's a bacteria that enters the human system through the fecal oral route, and because of poor water and sanitation, it can be actually present in water resources in many locations and forms. So it travels easily between water bodies. So just like I was mentioning, so that is the bacteria, and it can be in a very apparently healthy water ecosystem. It can also be in the water in the urban areas where water resources are frequently polluted. If you look at the global picture, just a little bit of background before we get into the megacity thing. If you look at the global picture, actually the main cholera problems are actually happening in Africa over the last 10 or 20 years. Especially the coastal countries in Africa are having massive diarrheal and cholera outbreaks over the last 10 years. But most of these actually outbreaks are fairly recent, and there is not enough data available to actually study them properly along with water resources data. So we have to go back to, I guess, where the data is. Before that, just another graphic on the megacities, how the cholera thing is actually becoming acute in developing world megacities. So this is a chart of the world's megacities. Many of you are familiar with the big growing megacities of Asia. So most of the growth is happening here, and tucked around there is Dhaka, Bangladesh. It's not really in your news for very frequently, but if you can see that the rate of growth here from 15 to 23 million, 53% is actually among the highest of all of these cities. And within a decade, it would be ranked 4th or 5th in the order of mega cities in the world. So that brings a massive challenge to us, where in terms of urban hydrology and the impacts on water and health. So, of course, all of you, I won't get into the detail of that, but of course, adding to that climate change, it is going to be very, urban areas are going to be the hotspots of water and health interactions, and extreme events can lead to very strong outbreaks of waterborne diseases. Back to this graphic, as I was saying, that although most of the cholera outbreaks are happening in Africa these days, most of the original cholera outbreaks actually originated from here, the native homeland of cholera. And that's where the city of Dhaka that I was just showing you, it actually is. And 6 of the 7 global pandemics of cholera actually originated from here. And they are right now they are the only place where you have a decent amount of data available, so that you can actually study the interactions between cholera outbreaks and water resources. And the other thing that should be pointed out is that this deltaic region in South Asia that is draining both the Ganges and the Brahmaputra rivers. You are very familiar with these rivers, I'm sure. So it kind of makes the perfect storm of large river, very high population, poverty, and a deltaic landscape for these biological setting for these pathogens. So that's the area I'm talking about. So a little bit of history. Dhaka was a Mughal outpost during the Mughal Empire. It was ruled from Delhi, and it was fairly picturesque like that now, but it has grown tremendously, and as the data suggests, it has grown into something like this. This is a very recent picture. So urban sprawl, a huge amount of population, and that leads to population pressure. I just have some pictures to throw you off, I would say. So So this is actually, this is an extreme case. This does not happen every day, but this is the annual religious holidays. People are going back home from Dhaka. So that shows that how much people are actually coming to Dhaka to work and just for their livelihoods, but actually would rather stay back home. And most of these people that are here in such conditions, they live in these urban informal settlements or slums. They are in around the fringes of the city, next to often polluted water bodies, and they have very limited water and sanitation infrastructure, as you can suspect from the picture. And this is a kind of a more this is a better picture which shows that how slums have grown over the last from 96 to 2005. The red, the areas in red are actually, I'm sorry, I did not put that, you cannot really read that here. The areas in red are in 96, and the areas in green are in 2005, in addition to those. So in 10 years, and who knows what's the situation right now, in 10 years, how rapidly the slums have grown, as you can see. Some really grim statistics on the left of these slum areas, where 90% live below the poverty line and 70% lack sanitation, and about 400,000 people moving to the cities every year. So you can imagine the pressure. You can never really catch up with that. So back to this. This is what these numbers. Now you can actually get a sense of how the growth rate has been so incredible. Among the megacities, Dhaka is having a lot of cholera, dengue, and rotavirus. Rotavirus is another diarrheal disease which is extremely deadly. The water issues in Dhaka that leads to the cholera outbreaks. I just wanted to throw some pictures. This is in the dry season. This is a monsoon-dominated region, so you have a lot of the rainfall in the monsoon season, but other times are fairly dry. So this is in the dry season when people have to line up for water from the municipal systems. And then in the monsoon, frequent rainfall outbursts, and the city gets flooded. So, and leads to the kind of growth that the city is having. This is a actually, unfortunately, very common scenario that you see in Dhaka. So you see a very healthy mix of pathogens and water, unfortunately. So if you look at the cholera data, which brings us back to the 30 years that we are looking at from 1980 to 2010. So we have a decreasing trend of fatalities. So we have learned how to deal with the disease, and we can reduce, we can make sure that nobody is dying, but the number of infections is still continuously increasing, and so the disease burden is extremely high, so prevention is somehow falling behind. We can save people from dying, but we cannot really stop infections. So some sort of early warning mechanisms are essential to change this trend. If we look at the 30 years of data, if you do a population, you might, the very first thought would come to us is that it must be the population, and even if you detrend, you see that there's a lot of variability. Like here, there's a lot of variability even after you detrend the cholera information. Also, within the disease counts, people showing up at the hospitals for different diarrheal disease symptoms, cholera is also, even within that disease counts, cholera shows, the color is not showing up very nicely, but there is a lot of variability in that as well. That means that cholera itself has a lot of variability and patterns associated with it that needs to be studied. If you look at the 30 years, it's a very strong increasing trend, both in incidences, that is the number of people showing up at the hospitals, as well as prevalence among the population. And what comes out, the key thing that should be noticed here is that there are two seasons that are very critical for cholera, and how the disease is rapidly increasing over the last 3 decades. So this is data divided into 3 decades, and how the dry season is becoming very dominant in the uh, uh, as time progresses. And if we actually look at the information of the fall season, it is actually very highly variable and becoming more epidemic in nature. So a mix of endemic and epidemic situations, which we think is related to the changes in the water environment in these two seasons, the dry season and the wet season, is leading to that. Cholera is just one disease. As I mentioned, there are many other or several other diarrheal diseases that have a tremendous impact on this megacity. On an average, cholera is about 28 to 30% of the total diarrheal burden. So whatever the understanding that comes out of this study, hopefully we'll be able to assist understanding the other diseases as well. So a little bit of background, if we want to understand what's happening in terms of cholera in this region. You are familiar with this huge river basin system, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna, that drains from the Himalayas through Bangladesh. And as you can see, Dhaka is right in the center of it. So it bears the full force of water scarcity in the dry season and massive floods in the wet season. So this is the Ganges, this is the Brahmaputra, this is the Ganges. Together we have this picture, annual picture like this. As you can see, the first few months are fairly dry. It actually gets really dry in the months of March, April, May, and then suddenly everything gets washed out later on. If we look at the interannual variability, both rivers, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, are highly variable in terms of their interannual variability, and also the dry season, the wet season, and the dry season. So altogether, it creates this perfect scenario of what we call it the epidemic, endemic, and mixed mode cholera outbreaks in this region. So what we see is essentially the same deltaic region. Dhaka is in the middle of it. There are two rivers that are draining through here, and what we see is in the coastal areas are typically experiencing a spring dry season outbreak. The inland regions are typically experiencing a fall flood-induced outbreak, whereas the middle portion faces both of these outbreaks actually in spring and in fall. And what happens so essentially this is just another picture of the same thing. So we see coastal outbreaks in the spring, we see inland outbreaks, fall outbreaks, and the middle of the floodplain corridors essentially see this double peak pattern. But it is also the center area is also the most populated part of the country, so they bear the force of both the outbreak patterns. So together, this is kind of a composite picture that we have put together, that in the dry season, so the coastal part, so this is, we are talking about months of January through May. The coastal processes, there is salinity, there is lack of fresh water from upstream. They create this environment of spring cholera outbreaks, which this is about, I would say, about 30 to 40 million people, I'm guessing, a rough estimation. And then in the next season, there is a larger force at play because of the monsoon, which is another 50 to 60 million people at least. So altogether, you see a huge burden of population vulnerability to these seasonal forces in the coast and inside, and also in the center part of the country, which is the most populated, and right where Dhaka is, kind of experiencing the worst of the processes. So this is put together. So we have the two major rivers almost draining through Dhaka, and we can use our water resources expertise to understand with the help of satellite sensors, like GRESS is one of the sensors we are using. We are also using TRIM for looking at previous years of rainfall, and hopefully with new sensors there will be more work on this. So we are trying to develop this multi-sensor prediction mechanism for cholera. This is a NASA Health and Air Quality project that is currently undergoing, and we are hoping that what we understand of these large-scale processes would be useful for us in terms of looking at the water and health interactions in the Dhaka region. Before I finish, I would like to talk about some of the institutional challenges that still remains. So, of course, understanding how our research actually relates to the needs on the ground and the water existing surveillance systems and how we can improve those, that is one of the major issues. But there are two other points that I wanted to mention is that in Bangladesh, you will be amazed to find that the health departments and the water departments, they do not even talk to each other. There is no such thing as a water and health body that looks into the water-borne diseases. And this institution called the ICDDRB, the International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research, they are the largest diarrheal disease hospital in the world, but they do not have any in-house water expertise, although they are working on water-related diseases. And this you have seen before, so essentially what I'm trying to show is that they do not have this large-scale understanding of what processes might be at play behind these diseases, and how the Bangladesh has developed a fairly well community on water resource expertise, but this community has not regularly interacted with the public health personnel at all. Only sometimes contributes as advisory roles as needed, and typically as part of the NGO efforts on water and sanitation in slum areas and things like that. But this whole notion of large-scale events affecting local-scale water and health is still not there yet. I have to mention this ICDDRB. They are doing, despite the odds, they are doing a tremendous job in terms of developing solutions, at least for saving lives. The oral rehydration therapy that saves the kids from dying from cholera. Meanwhile, the health departments, this is a picture I took last year of a local health center. This is the good picture of this place, actually. You don't want to go on the backside of it. They dump their waste into the water puddles. So despite tremendous odds, they are trying to develop their own capacity in water and health management, and I think our expertise can actually play a role here. So it's a big, altogether it makes a very big, I would say, research field where our expertise and the changes in water management, changes in water policy, how these has affected health indicators, and what can we do to improve the situation. So I have to thank my partners in the different institutions in West Virginia, Maryland, in Bangladesh, the ICDDRB and the Institute of Water and Flood Management, and also the two ongoing NASA grants and my my current location at University of Rhode Island, the College of Engineering. I hope that this whole, the main issue in here, the safe water, will be resolved for many of these global water hotspots, the megacities. But I want to leave with one question: is this water even safe? Because piped water, which is considered the safe, at least the thing that these people can benefit from, is not necessarily again safe. It's just piped water, that's all. All right? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next speaker is local. We have Professor Jeffrey Brawn, who is professor and head of the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences here at the University of Illinois. He received his PhD in ecology from Northern Arizona University, although I'm fond of teasing him that he's really from Massachusetts, like me. special kind of people from there. And his research focuses at the intersection of tropical ecology with an emphasis on birds, infectious disease, and agriculture. It's actually a lot of fun to walk with Jeff to a meeting. We were going to a meeting once, and he paused. He said, "There are 4 kinds of warblers in that tree over there." And I saw and heard nothing. I just, the world is a lesser thing for me. He has published many papers. He's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Ornithologists Union. And he's going to talk to us about climate change, precipitation regimes, and the integrity of tropical ecosystems.
Well, thank you, Amy, and I am indeed a bird nerd, but I'll try and get around that in this talk. So what I want to talk about today, and some of the issues that I'm going to be discussing today have been actually shown very well already, especially what I'm going to talk about is precipitation regimes at tropical latitudes. And what I want to develop is that the biological systems at tropical latitudes are very sensitive to precipitation regimes. And it's not just how much it falls, but it's when it falls as well. And the last talk showed that very well, that this can really have important outcomes for agroecology, for social outcomes, public health, and also for biological systems. So the tropics, usually definitions actually vary on this, but it's usually between 28 degrees north and south. That's what we usually think of as the tropics. There's actually, ecologists being the way they are, we have to subdivide the tropics quite a bit. And with what we think is rainforest, or what we usually call rainforest, it isn't all rainforest. There's a lot of gradation in the tropics with what we think of as tropical forests. So a rainforest is really wet. Okay, it rains almost all the time. There's not much of a dry season. Where I work in the Republic of Panama, it's about 1,800 millimeters of rain a year, has a distinctive dry season. That's what's called a moist forest. So if you sort of stratify it by rainforest, it's actually the distribution of tropical rainforests is a lot less. But I'm not just going to talk about rainforests. I'm just going to talk about what we would call tropical, not subtropical, but tropical systems. Okay? And what I want to talk about, or what I really want to develop, is that what goes on at tropical latitudes really does have global importance and outcomes. And I think that this has outcomes for people, it has outcomes for agroecology and food security, and it also has phenomenal outcomes for what goes on with biodiversity. And those of you involved with climate modeling and whatnot know how important the tropics are, carbon sequestration and other things, how important the tropics are for climate change as well. So if we look at the tropics and you look at the global distribution of people, a lot of people are concentrated at tropical latitudes. And if you stratified this graph to put people that are at poverty or facing difficult situations or are living in difficult conditions, as we just saw a good example, the tropics, or what goes on environmentally with the tropics, is exceedingly important. Coincidentally enough, where there's people, they also have to grow food, and this is just in terms of land cover, not in terms of productivity, but just in terms of land cover, where we're growing crops. And you can see that a lot of crops are grown at tropical latitudes as well. So we have a lot of people at tropical latitudes, we're growing a lot of food at tropical latitudes, and there's just phenomenal biodiversity at tropical latitudes. Fully half the species that exist on the planet, especially with vertebrates, exist at tropical latitudes. So the consequences of anything that changes in the tropics is very, very important. And it looks like there's going to be very important changes that are emerging with climate change, not just because of deforestation and whatnot, but as I hope to develop, some of the issues are relatively subtle and have to do with climate change. So this is, for those of you who are biodiversity people or tropical nuts, this is kind of a familiar story. There's a lot of deforestation in the tropics, most of it owing to agriculture. We need the land, we need services from the land, we need productivity from the land, and a lot of tropical habitat is disappearing because we need to grow food. So pasturing, small-scale agriculture, increasingly large-scale agriculture, and logging is actually a small source of habitat loss in the tropics. We have less than half of what used to be in the tropics, and the paleotropics, or the old world tropics, are especially in peril. There's been just phenomenal habitat loss in the paleotropics, places like West Central Africa. In the neotropics, or the New World tropics, it's actually still relatively intact. The Amazon basin, comparatively speaking, is relatively intact. So that's an opportunity or a threat, depending on how you look at it. And I should point out that the country where the highest rate of tropical loss right now is occurring is Brazil. So tropical biologists or conservation biologists have been on this for a while as far as what's going to go on with climate change. Okay? And the emphasis early on had to do with temperature. What's going to go on with temperature? And temperature and precipitation are obviously coupled with each other. They're not independent of one another. But originally people were just talking about global warming and how things that are in the lowland forest are going to have to migrate up, and how and things that are in the upper part of the forest, where are they going to go, and are there going to be migration refugia or whatnot for tropical biota that can actually undergo some sort of movements. Okay? And underneath all this has always been the assumption that the sensitivity of tropical biota and the sensitivity of tropical systems is rather high. And that's another point that I'll return to. So precipitation in recent years is actually starting to emerge, or precipitation regime is starting to emerge as a very important factor in what goes on in the tropics. We just saw a really clear example of how it may affect public health, it may affect social welfare and environmental justice. Okay, but it may affect biodiversity and it may affect productivity in terms of agroecology. And the reason for this is that tropical systems may be very sensitive to change. So this is one example, or this is just one realization of what may go on with precipitation by the end of the 21st century. And there's been a lot of talk about how there's lots of different models and lots of different maps and whatnot. This is just one realization of what may happen. Whether this one has more validity to it than another one, I don't know. I'm not a climate modeler. This is another one that's a little more recent. This is from the last assessment. You can see the graph on the right. You can see that indeed a lot of tropical places look like they're going to get drier. Okay. Now I don't want to say all places in tropical latitudes are going to get drier. There's some models that say the dry areas are going to get drier, the wet areas are going to get wetter. There's just going to be more geographic variation in precipitation regimes. But what I'm going to talk about a lot is actually seasonal drought and intensity of the dry season. And I should point out that not even all tropical forests have a dry season. There's some areas that rain so much it rains all the time. There really is no dry season. But there may be changes in precipitation regimes there as well. So the amount and timing of rainfall is really a key evolutionary and ecological determinant of the biology of tropical biota. And what I mean by that is their natural history or their life histories. Okay? There is seasonality in the tropics. We don't think of it compared to here. There's not a lot of seasonality, but there is distinctive seasonality and biological rhythms at tropical latitudes for trees, for birds, mammals, what have you. Okay, and a lot of it is keyed to seasonality from when rain falls. And when we get a deviation from what are quote-unquote natural precipitation regimes, the species or the biological systems at tropical latitudes may be differentially sensitive. And the reason for that is that they haven't been in very variable environments in the past, and evolutionarily they just may not have the hardware or the physiological capability of being flexible in a changing environment. So this is an example of how things are keyed to the wet season versus the dry season, or keyed to rain. This is in Panama, and this species that you see flowering is Tabebuia guayacán, and it rains, and you'll start to see these flowers 2 or 3 days later. Okay, it's keyed to dry season rains, all right? More generally, if you look at tropical biota, and especially vertebrates, which is what I study, okay, most of the breeding effort, most of the reproductive effort of the breeding season for a lot of these species is when it starts raining, okay? They muddle through the dry season, and then when the dry season is over and starts raining, you get a lot of fruit, you get a lot of flower production, you get a lot of arthropods running around, you get a lot of things that eat the arthropods like birds, and you just get a lot of, it's the equivalent of our late spring and early summer when everything's just happening in terms of the reproductive strategies of these species. Now the sensitivity of these species And there's a lot of people working on this now from either a behavioral or a physiological viewpoint, and this is for people that work on trees, plant physiologists, and also animal physiologists. And actually, the conceptual framework of this was set out in 1967 by a paper by Daniel Jansen, who's sort of a tropical guru, works a lot in dry forests in Costa Rica. And Jansen posed the question, why are mountain passes higher in the tropics? And what he was saying was, this was a biogeographic paper, and he was saying that species in the tropics can't bridge discontinuities, can't get over a mountain pass because they're not used to the cold weather. They're not used to less oxygen. They just don't have the physiological flexibility because they're in more, relatively speaking, aseasonal and predictable environments. So this paper was published a long time ago. It's probably cited about 500 times a year now because of climate change, and that the conceptual basis for this sensitivity actually has to do with the evolutionary history of these species in a relatively predictable environment. Okay, so now people are talking a lot more about changes in rainfall seasonality in the tropics and what's going to happen. And the people the biologists that have really been on the forefront of this are the forest ecologists. There's been a lot of time spent on what's going on with vegetation dynamics and rainfall seasonality in the Amazon basin, in the Paleotropics, and in the Neotropics. So this is just one set of maps that shows the top, and A there shows rainfall. Okay, so I don't need to get into the details. It's just that there's heterogeneity in the amount of rainfall spatially. Okay. And then the seasonality is the middle graph, so where it's a hotter color, there's more seasonality, there's more differences between the amount of rainfall in the dry season and the wet season. And dry season is a bit of a misnomer. It will rain in the dry season, it just rains less, okay? And then changes in the intensity of seasonality, and that's going to be a key on this, is changes in intensity of seasonality. That seems to be undergoing some sort of change, especially in the Neotropics and in Africa. And a lot of people are starting to notice that this is starting to have biological outcomes. All right, so this is from Dr. Fu, who's in the audience. This is a graph from one of her papers, and you can see that she derived a pattern from 1980 through 2010 where the dry season, or length of the dry season, has actually increased owing to a delay in the end of the dry season. So what this means is seasonal drought becomes more intense, okay? And the concomitant with that is a decrease in rainfall. So throughout a lot of parts, at least in southern Amazonia here, and this is not the same way in the whole Amazon basin. Some areas are actually getting a little wetter, okay? Again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but at least in this area, and this is a large area, okay, there is a drying trend and seasonal drought is becoming more intense. And this is starting to be noticed in a lot of other areas as well, especially in West Central Africa. Okay. So Rick Condit, who's an Illinois grad, I might add, published a paper with some colleagues in PNAS last year. And in Panama, they looked at species across a moisture gradient. So in the Isthmus of Panama, it actually goes from quite wet to dry, okay? And they looked at the distribution of trees across the Isthmus of Panama, which is about 50 miles wide, okay? And they looked at what was by far the most important determinant of the distribution of 550 species of trees was intensity of seasonal drought or moisture, okay? And there was some soil, some phosphorus and whatnot. They also looked at that. But, and this is, you don't need to read the small print here, just that the more gray and the higher those dots are, the more important a factor is. And by far, seasonal availability or seasonal drought of moisture was the most important determinant of distributions of trees, the most important determinant of the structure of these tropical forests across this isthmus. The mechanism for this seems to be hydraulic failure. And this is another paper that was published. And all this shows is that the sensitivity of trees, okay, the sensitivity of trees to dryness and whether they're going to suffer from hydraulic failure and die, okay, or not do very well, has to do with where they are and how much rainfall there is. In the areas where there's the most rainfall and the least seasonality, those are the species that are the most sensitive to drying. Okay, and this actually fits with what Jansen said, is things that are in the least seasonal environments have the least evolutionary history in variable environments. But now with climate change, as I've shown you, we have variation being imposed on these systems. And some of these systems just aren't going to be able to persist because they haven't evolutionarily seen this kind of variation. So we're imposing wholesale change in large regions of the neotropics and the paleotropics. All right, so this is another, in fact, someone showed this cover from the IPCC before. And you can see that there's going to be change in consecutive dry days, which is analogous to just how long the dry season is going to be. And you can see that in certain areas, especially in the Amazon basin, especially in West Central Africa, Southern Africa, and throughout large parts of the paleotropics, India, Indonesia, and whatnot. At least by this realization, it looks like there's going to be a lot more seasonality, and that moisture, there's going to be a lot more dryness in the soil. This is going to have phenomenal repercussions for agriculture. And a lot of people know this, and a lot of the geneticists are trying to get rice that will grow in drier conditions and whatnot. This is reasonably well known by the agronomic community, but we don't really know what's going to go on with biological systems. So it looks like we may get wholesale change in some of the systems that we're seeing, some of the systems that I study in the tropics because of this long-term change in precipitation regime. So what goes on with animal populations? I'm showing this photo because it's kind of a pretty bird, and I thought I'd show a photo of an organism that people don't eat, okay? So this thing's only 10 grams and it's lousy eating, okay? So anyways, this is what's called a red-capped manakin. And these are the kind of birds that I study. So I'm going to go into a study from my lab and just what may be happening with a change in length of the dry season and the population ecology of some birds in Panama. So I work in Panama, and I work on lowland forest birds by what's called the old canal zone. And it's moist lowland forest, pretty contiguous, pretty good shaped forest, large park and whatnot. And we do a lot of sampling. And what we do, I'm not going to go into the details here, but we do a lot of what's called mark recapture sampling. Basically, to make a long story short, we catch these birds, we put a band on them, we mark them, and we let them go, okay? And you do that over a long period of time, you can model those data, you can model that sampling process in order to get estimates of some very important demographic parameters that interest population biologists and also relate to viability of these populations. So you can talk about survival rate or apparent survival rate, recruitment, which is number of new animals coming into an area on an annual basis, and also population growth or lambda, and I'm going to focus on that. So what population growth or lambda is just rate of change in a population. If lambda is 1, it's at steady state. If it's below 1, it's shrinking. If it's above 1, it's growing. Same thing that human demographers use. And these are estimated rates of lambda from the late 1970s. That wasn't my work. I'm not quite that old, up through the present actually, but we only modeled it up through 2011 here. And you can see that this is a population for this particular species is at reasonable equilibrium, where the average value of lambda is 1. And that's what's expected. There's a lot of theory in population ecology that predicts that, okay, barring some kind of major environmental perturbation. A little more variance with this species. This species is related to our wrens, okay? You get a lot of annual variation. You kind of see this pattern a lot where there's what's called a lot of density-dependent regulation in these populations. But what we did was, when we have this amount of variation in lambda, we thought we'd relate it to length of the dry season. Now, this time series is stationary, okay? There hasn't been a trend in length of the dry season or in the amount of annual rainfall during the time period that we've been working. But there is quite a bit of variation. El Nino years, the dry season's really long. There appears to be a whopper potentiating down there right now, although it started raining in the last week or so. So we decided to just relate or look at the association between lambda, population growth rate, and length of the dry season. Now, to make a long story short on this, what this is regression coefficients between length of the dry season and lambda over this 33-year period. These are average or median values over that 33-year period, and these are Bayesian credible intervals. What this means is the ones that are below 0, that means there's a significant bad effect of lengthening dry season on the viability of these populations. This is for 20 species, and they're just 4-letter codes there on the bottom. It doesn't really matter which ones they are, but 7 of the 20 species had a significant or an important negative relationship. So that means that if we get a longer dry season, almost a third or over a third of these species are going to be threatened. That's a lot, okay? If you take those regression coefficients and just put a line there for that slope, okay, and take a quantum leap in faith and say that it's a linear relationship, if you start to look at what may happen with the dry season, and the average is about 128 days now, but what may happen with the dry season, you can see that there's a potential for what's called community reorganization here. A lot of these species are really going to be threatened and are going to drop out of that community. We did a lot of simulation analyses on this, and indeed, even with just a 10% increase in the length of the dry season, and do all this stochastic modeling out for 25 and 50 years, it ends up with a very different looking community than we have there today. And that 10% is conservative for what's expected. One last thing, one last slide before Amy throws me off here, is that the scale of drying can actually be affected, or the drying effect in the tropics isn't just a regional thing. It can actually be affected by local, the scale can be local and going to be conditional on land use. Those of you familiar with the tropics know that a lot of rainfall in the tropics is convective, okay? That heat builds up and moisture goes up out of the atmosphere from the forest. And if you have a small amount of deforestation in a given area, that actually increases local rainfall. But if you have a lot of deforestation, and they have that percentage-wise there, you're actually going to exacerbate the regional drying problem because there's going to be less moisture that goes up out of the forest. So agriculture and land use and regional climate change are related here, okay? And how the type of landscape that we have is really going to affect this drying effect. This is this graph actually scared the crap out of me, but I found it really, really interesting. So I almost lost sleep over this one. All right, so just to sum up, I think that hopefully I've shown that the tropics are an interesting place. The tropics are a place that's under a lot of threat, and that this threat is going to be by virtue of how we use the land and also what's going on with climate change. And if things don't go differently, okay, and that's another discussion, I think that a lot of the tropical forests that I study and a lot of tropical forests everywhere are going to function very differently, and they're probably really going to sound differently as well. So thanks.
We economists are always jealous at these talks because we don't have pictures. It's very dry. Okay. Okay, our next speaker is a visitor. We have Professor Alan Knapp. He is a professor of biology at Colorado State University and has been involved, I have so much respect for this, in large-scale ecosystem research through one of the NSF's long-term ecological research stations for over 20 years. And not just the commitment to the research, but the commitment to dealing with other people, because those tend to be very multidisciplinary projects. Yeah, he must be a very patient man. And so his research has focused on understanding how forecasted climate change is going to affect ecosystem structure and function. And so welcome, Alan Knapp.
Well, thank you very much. And I must admit, thank you all for being here. If you looked at the weather outside right now, I'm from Fort Collins, Colorado, and it would be me and the speakers in a Congress there right now. Everyone would be at the brew pubs in Fort Collins. So I really appreciate you guys hanging in there and hanging out with us this afternoon. I want to take a little different approach than what some of our previous speakers had, and I want to begin by tying to last night's keynote address. Which I thought was great, and I'm sure you all did as well. And I thought there were many great things about it, but a couple things really stood out. One is that Professor Glennon did a great job of sort of talking about the water crisis, giving us lots of facts and figures, but then he also, as I've underlined here on the slide, talked about what to do about it as well. Right? And many of the talks we've heard today, earlier this morning in particular, were oftentimes solution-oriented, right? So we have these problems, and what can we do to help deal with those? And I'm a bit envious of that approach. One of the other interesting things in Professor Glennon's talk is he provided some great quotes. And one quote that he paraphrased very nicely is a famous one by Mark Twain, that a great deal has been said about the weather, but very little has been done. And that resonates with ecologists, I think, a lot more, because my job here and the job of our previous previous speaker as well, is to really talk about natural ecosystems, climate change, and the water crisis. And we don't manage, we can't do much with natural ecosystems. We don't manage them by virtue of the fact they're natural ecosystems. We don't manage them like we do cities or industry or agriculture. And so when we think about the water crisis and we think about climate change influencing natural ecosystems, our goal is to really understand how those systems are likely to change, how their functioning is likely to change, right? And so we can deal with the consequences via adaptation or mitigation strategies. And so that's really the approach we take is basic understanding of how these systems are changing. We all know what the many ecosystem services that are provided by these different biome types are, and then how can we deal with the consequences of that change. So I want to talk today about grasslands, a departure from the beautiful tropical forest talk of a few minutes ago, and focus really on trying to understand how climate change and the water crisis are likely to affect these ecosystems. So let me begin with some background about what we do know, and then we'll talk a lot about what we don't know. So what do we know about water, ecosystem services, and climate change? Well, there are three things I feel pretty confident in saying, and I'll show you some data to back these up. Water availability or precipitation in general is related to basic ecosystem function in virtually all of Earth's terrestrial ecosystems, and we just saw a beautiful example of that even in wet ecosystems. With increasing air temperatures, the water balance of all ecosystems is changing and will continue to change. And then, as we've all heard, and we've talked about at this conference or this Congress, there's a lot of alterations in precipitation inputs. And the types of alterations are actually quite staggering, both in amount, variability, seasonality, extremes. It goes on and on. And even though you don't need to see them, I'm going to show you some more examples of those today in this presentation. What I want to spend most of the time, though, is focusing on what we know the least about, which is how this, what is oftentimes called an intensified global hydrological cycle, is likely to affect ecosystems worldwide, but particularly in grasslands. The examples I'll give you are for grasslands primarily. All right, so here's how we saw some previous maps like this. Here's how ecologists view the world, not in political boundaries, not in boundaries of countries, but in terms of biomes, the kind of vegetation tends to exist there. And if you sample the world, as we have done collectively as ecologists, and you ask questions about, you look at the productivity of these ecosystems and you ask what environmental correlates best predict or best explain patterns of productivity, it turns out MAP in this graph, mean annual precipitation, does the best job of explaining total net primary production. That's what the TNPP stands for across much of the globe, even in those wet systems. Now, people have looked at temperature, people have looked at edaphic factors, fertility. It turns out if you're looking for one single factor, it tends to be precipitation, water inputs, that tends to affect the functioning of most biomes, most ecosystems worldwide. Now, where the curve is the steepest is there, which also happens to be where we are. And if you look across the Great Plains, right, so I live in the light blue portion of this particular map here, the central grasslands of the U.S. If you go to the far right, of course, to the pink portion, here we are in Champaign, Urbana, Illinois. This is where there is really a strong relationship between changes in precipitation and changes in ecosystem services or the functioning of these grasslands. So what's going to happen to these precipitation patterns? If precipitation is so tightly coupled to function and ecosystem services, what's likely to happen? Well, I'll run through these quickly because we know what the predictions are. But in many cases, what I'm going to show you aren't predictions. These are actual changes that have already been observed. So here's observed precipitation change globally, right, over the last 100 years or so. And you'll see the blue is increases, the brown is decreases. And in most cases, precipitation is actually increasing. And this is predicted based upon a warmer atmosphere. But if you look at soil moisture, right, which brings into account the greater warming temperatures and the greater evaporative demand, we see a very different picture, right? We see lots of areas getting wet or more soil moisture. We see a lot of other areas getting drier. What always strikes me about this particular map isn't so much the pattern, it's that basically no place stays the same. So across the globe, it seems like every place is either going to get wetter or drier, at least in terms of the delivery of moisture to plants. And that concerns ecologists, right? Because we know how important precipitation patterns are, and it's basically changing either up or down everywhere, and is projected to continue to change as well. So it's not just precipitation amounts and soil moisture, of course, as we just heard, it's precipitation patterns are changing as well. The one I will talk the most about today are changes in the size of rainfall events. So this is average daily intensity of rainfall, and green indicates an increase globally. As you can see, the globe is almost completely green. And so everywhere the predictions are for individual rainfall events to become larger in the future. So the future looks something like this. If you project way out, as they do in the IPCC, out to 2100, you see all the curves going up for these different diagrams. These are just either the percent increases of the wettest consecutive 5 days, or the wettest days possible, the wettest days that are measured in those systems. And the point is they all go up, right? So the predictions are for this to happen, but the future is already here. So if you look at the United States and you look at the number of days with rainfall events over 50 millimeters, it's been increasing for a long time already. We're already seeing these patterns manifest across the United States. We're seeing these larger rainfall events. And in the part of the world I work in, the grasslands, the Central Plains, we've noticed this as well. So these are data from some analysis across Oklahoma. The three particular panels there, A, B, and C, are just western, central, and eastern Oklahoma. And so no matter where you are across that state, there's been this decadal march in terms of the increase in the size of rainfall events over the last 30 or 40 years. And so, again, we're not relying upon projections in the future. In many cases, these data already exist, and we see these patterns occurring. Surprisingly, right, it oftentimes surprises me, is that despite having larger events, we're also going to have more dry days, and we heard that as well in the tropics. Turns out that's a global phenomenon as well. We'll have an increase in the number of dry days per year, so bigger events, more dry days. And then, of course, there's the longer time scale changes that are happening, right? The risk of drought goes up everywhere. This is a recent paper talking about the risk of drought in the Central Plains, where we are, in the American Southwest. There's the drought monitor, the most recent one showing California in the drought now. Of course, droughts in the Midwest are nothing new, right? We know about the droughts of the 30s. We can anticipate those sorts of droughts being more frequent and perhaps even more severe in the future. To balance that, if you look at the temporal pattern of changes in extreme wet years, they're also increasing. So not only do we have more variability within years in rainfall events, for example, but we have an expectation of, and we see increases already in the number of drought years, as well as in the number of really, really wet years that are occurring. So we're seeing huge swings in huge increases in interannual variability. So let's summarize, right? So what's our future look like for ecosystems in general and for grasslands in particular? Well, we see more precipitation almost everywhere, but we see drier soils in most places. We see more intense and large rainfall events, but also more days without rain. We see more frequent and extreme droughts, but also more extreme wet years, right? So these are pretty dramatic changes to think about when you're trying to understand how natural ecosystems are likely to function. And then every time I think it can't get any worse, it does. So here's a recent paper from Nature Climate Change from some analysis done in Australia. And what they found is they're seeing increases in precipitation extremes in the summer, but decreases in the winter. So at some parts of the world, right, the patterns aren't even consistent within seasons. So we're seeing these changes in rainfall regimes occur in very complex ways. All right, so let's again think about this as, this is what I would call the very definition of an intensified global hydrological cycle, where everything is becoming more extreme and variability is getting greater almost everywhere, and certainly in grasslands. All right, so what to do? Well, this is one of my favorite articles from The Onion, which is something everyone should read. I got up this morning and read CNN and saw that Donald Trump had increased his lead in the poll, so I'm changing my homepage of The Onion from now on. I think it should be the one I should read instead for my news. But basically, what this says is this is hard, right? Dealing with these changes are indeed a challenge. So what can we do as ecologists? What should we do as ecologists to try and grapple with these particular issues? Well, one thing we need to do is change the way we do research. And that's sort of the take-home message I will leave with you today, but it'll take me a while to get there. But I want to begin with that. We need to change the way we approach the research that we do in these ecosystems if we're going to make any headway in trying to understand how these ecosystems are likely to respond to change. And here are three reasons why. One is that these climatic changes and the net result of these climatic changes are going to lead to novel climates for most ecosystems, different than what we've studied in the past. So what we know about these ecosystems in the past is not necessarily going to help us that much in the future. So we need to engage in new studies to try and understand and predict the future. these changes are chronic, right? So all these climatic changes are directional. They're not going away. It's not going to start cooling down again. Rainfall regimes aren't going back. And so doing short-term experiments are not necessarily going to give us the answers we need, because the march of these changes continues on and on and on. So it says something about the need for long-term experiments, something I've been involved in for a long time. And then these changes are global, right? They're occurring everywhere. And so ecologists traditionally have been focused on single site studies. We tend to work in our backyard or near us, some exceptions, of course, those who work in the tropics. And as a result, those single site studies tend to be less valuable, because we're dealing with a global phenomenon now as opposed to local phenomenon. All right, so let me give you 3 examples. I apologize in advance for subjecting you to data this late in the day, but I have to show you some data, just like our previous speaker did, because these are the hard-earned data that we collect in my lab that relate to these particular issues. So let me talk about the kind of experiments or studies I think ecologists need to begin doing, and we are doing these to try and understand how these systems are going to respond to climate change. This is one that's been done it actually concluded now. It's been done in the grasslands of Kansas. It was a 15-year experiment. It was called the RAMPS experiment, and the idea is simply to try and understand how these changes in rainfall patterns, larger events, longer dry periods between events, are likely to impact this grassland. This is a grassland that's economically important for grazing in eastern Kansas. And so you see these shelters, these are basically just commercial greenhouses with roofs but no sidewalls. They collect natural rainfall, right, and they allow us to reapply it beneath them. So this is what it looks like underneath the roofs. The idea of this experiment is to collect rainfall, store it in those large tanks, and then reapply it in an experimental protocol. So in contrast to Mark Twain's quote, we are doing something about the weather in Kansas, at least on a 5 by 5 meter plot scale, right? And so what this experiment does is it simply does not change the amount of rainfall that occurs naturally in this grassland. All it does is change the ambient rainfall pattern, whatever that is, to a pattern where you have fewer events, but the events are really large, okay, without changing the total amount of rainfall at all. So it's a very simple experiment in that regard that allows us to assess independently the effect of just changes in rainfall pattern without rainfall amount. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like, the top is what a typical ambient rainfall pattern would be, usually dominated by a lot of small events, right? Average event size maybe 18 or so millimeters in this part of the world. The alteration, the experimental alteration, is actually for a 3-fold reduction in the number of events, so 3-fold fewer rainfall events. But each event is 3 times as large as the natural event would be. So fewer events, much larger size to these events. All right? So what happens when you do that? Well, any soil hydrologist could predict what would happen to soil moisture. This is a complicated graph that has a simple message. The top is the seasonal course of soil moisture in this grassland. It's wet in the spring. As you can see, it gradually dries down over the course of the summer. And then gets wet again. And of course, if you change that rainfall pattern to one of extremes, big events and long dry periods, you see this sawtooth pattern below. So you change the variability in soil moisture dramatically by altering rainfall patterns, sizes, and the time between events without actually altering the amount. So you see big differences in soil moisture variability in this system as a result of this change in precipitation. And the take-home message from that, this is just ANPP. This is productivity, how much grass is growing, for example, versus how variable that soil moisture is as a result of these treatments. On the far right are the few larger events, right? The altered rainfall pattern, right? The higher levels of productivity occur where you have the ambient rainfall patterns. And the point of this graph is, after 15 years, is that we can simply say that if these rainfall patterns get altered this way, productivity will decline. The amount of grass that grows, the amount of grass available for cattle to graze will decrease in this system as a result. Now, I need to show this graph partly because of the importance of long-term data and partly for other reasons as well. So this is the whole course of the data for this experiment. The ambient versus the altered. The ambient are the dark symbols, the altered are the open symbols. Over the course of the experiment, there's only a modest reduction, okay, about 11%. In this system, some years up to 22%. But the point I want to make about this particular graph is this was only the kind of pattern we could see after 15 years. Most of our funding agencies fund us for 3 years, right? So if you just pick any random 3, or not random, if you pick 3 particular years in this system and do the study, you can get great results, right? You can show what we showed in the long term. You can find just as many 3-year periods where you would see no effect of this change in precipitation on the system. And then sort of everyone's worst nightmare, you can find a 3-year run where 1 year is spectacular and the other 2 years show no response at all. What do you conclude from a study like that? So it requires these long-term studies to really get at these answers. Okay, quickly, a couple of other examples I can provide for you. It's not just enough to do these experiments at single sites. We oftentimes like to think that a grassland is a grassland is a grassland. That's not the case. Quickly, this is an experiment from a grad student of mine. That's a picture of her up in the corner. If you look carefully, she's smiling. She's smiling because this is at the start of the experiment. Essentially, what she did is she conducted a study similar to the previous one across those 3 sites. See the 3 stars in the middle on that map. From the dry grasslands of Colorado to the central grasslands to the wetter grasslands in the east. And the experiment is essentially what I just talked about. She imposed at each of these sites either a few really large events or many small events and asked the question, are all these grasslands going to respond similarly to these changes in rainfall patterns? And what she found is, across this gradient, is that in the wettest site, as I just showed you, you see a decrease, about a 15% decrease as you shift from small events to much larger and fewer events. But she saw the opposite impact in the drier grasslands. Their productivity increased as a result of these large events. And the reason why we think is because these very large events soak down deeper into the soil, less is lost via evaporation from the system, more is available for plants, it gets down deeper into the soil, and the systems actually benefit from having these fewer and larger events. And then finally, an experiment done by another student, she's also smiling in this picture, that's also taken early on in the experiment, was that this is a student who looked at a 2-year drought, all in one ecosystem type, one grassland type, the short grass steppe, the driest of these grasslands, they're shown in the pink. And she did this experiment for a totally different reason, but one of the things she did was she imposed drought for 2 different years. She removed either 50% or 80% of the growing season rainfall in this grassland. She was actually looking at invasion of invasive species in this system. And quickly, these are the data. This is just the soil water content data for those 3 sites, a northern site, a central site, and a southern site. Notice how beautifully the experiment worked. Her control plots are the wettest, and her -50 and -80 are the drier of the 3. So the experiment worked beautifully. But when she looked at productivity in this system, how it responded, right, she found in the northern sites it also responded as you would expect. You can see a 30% reduction in productivity with drought in the first year and 45% the second year. But across the rest of the gradient, only 1 other year showed a response to drought. Fully half the time, this grassland didn't respond to drought at all. Right? We spent a lot of time, as you can guess, trying to understand why half the time the system was responding to drought and half the time it wasn't. And it turns out the answer had to do with the size of these rainfall events again. Right? It turns out that in the years in the experimental sites where she saw no response, the rainfall events were large just naturally. And where it was quite sensitive to drought, the rainfall events were small. And so there's a nice interaction between the size of rain events and the impact of drought in this ecosystem. And so it raises an interesting question about how these increases in event size will interact with drought in the future in these grasslands. It turns out I was at a conference in Israel where they worry a lot about water, and they saw the same thing there in their forests, in their very dry forests. In years of drought, if they had a few large events, the system behaved as if it was a normal year. And so these shifts towards bigger rainfall events in some systems might help offset these changes. All right, so let me conclude by saying what ecologists need to do. I've given you a hint of this, but let me just finish. This is the message I always give to my colleagues. I thought I'd share it with you as well. So what do we really need to do to increase our understanding? We need to take a page from the IPCC, I think. This is a group of physical scientists, as we all know, who did get together, focus on a particular issue, and they've done a really great job of giving us the information we need to think about the future in terms of climate change. I would argue that ecologists are more like this. And by that I mean we tend to be a fairly eccentric group. We tend to, again, like to work where we like to work. We tend not to be coordinated. We've never had anything to really rally ourselves around in the past. But that has to change, right? We have to think about working together as a community of ecologists, doing the kinds of experiments across multiple sites in comparable ways that will allow us to address these bigger issues of climate change across natural ecosystems. And fortunately, that's changing. There are now grassroots efforts. There's a project out there called DroughtNet, where we are imposing identical droughts with identical infrastructure across all sorts of ecosystems, from forests to deserts to grasslands, to try and understand how different ecosystems are likely to be more or less sensitive to climate changes in the future. Thanks very much.
Okay, and last but most certainly not least, we have Dr. Marilyn O'Hara Ruiz. Marilyn is a professor here. Well, you're a professor here, yeah. It just says you're a medical geographer in the College of Veterinary Medicine in Illinois. And she has her PhD in geography from the University of Florida, so it's very interesting. She's a geographer in vet med. And I think that speaks to her research. So she studies spatial epidemiology of infectious diseases, and especially spatial and temporal differences in risk. Her PhD is from the University of Florida, and she has been a Fulbright senior scholar at the University of Delhi in India. And in her copious spare time, she assists local health departments and mosquito abatement districts in actually trying to help. So welcome, Marilyn.
Thank you so much, Amy. That's such a kind introduction, and I've enjoyed hearing what you have to say about everybody. So I will not be talking so much about my own work today, although originally I thought I was going to do that when I started putting together my presentation. And I realized really the message I really want to get across is how do the people in public health working on the front lines of trying to reduce infectious disease in particular, what do they need from the people who are doing work with water resources? So what I'll then look at is some of the background on mosquito-borne diseases and the way that public health agencies have been dealing with those throughout history. And then I'd like to also point out some possible ways or some approaches using modeling and interdisciplinary work where we can see how does water management and water related modeling fit into trying to really address these public health issues. So I've been sitting here listening to all this talk about water all day and thinking, but we have to say something about mosquitoes. They are so integral to water. So I borrowed this graph here from Bill Gates. I thought it was quite effective. And his point is that the mosquito is really the world's deadliest animal. It's down here over 700,000 deaths per year are attributed to mosquitoes. That number is a bit of a loose number, and I didn't go back and look for it, but we have at the very top there are 10 deaths from sharks annually. So, one death from a shark, and you have 3 major motion pictures, and you have, unfortunately, on a much more serious scale, many children are dying before they reach the age of 5 from malaria and from dengue throughout the world. So he put together a nice video and tried to promote Mosquito Week. So if you're interested, go find his little video on Mosquito Week. There's some great graphics there about mosquitoes. So when we think about water resources and public health, this table is adapted from something that World Health Organization put together. And when we hear a lot about issues related to water, we're often thinking about water quality and contamination and fecal-oral issues. And that's what the first 3 groups there are, where we see things like typhoid, cholera, then schistosomiasis gets us into a slightly different area where we have snails that actually have a parasite, and that is in the water that people can pick up because of the parasite's life cycle. And then at the bottom here, we have the vector-borne diseases, and in particular, I'll be talking about the mosquito-borne diseases, because part of the life cycle of mosquitoes is in water. So here is one of the graphics from the Gates video. I don't think I've ever seen this much biomass made up of mosquito larvae personally, but all those things there are mosquito larvae, and they're all moving around, and they're coming to the top of the surface there to get the air and then wiggling down through. So mosquitoes actually have an aquatic cycle, which is the eggs are laid often in water, or they need water in order to hatch, and then you have the larvae and you have the pupas. So then they emerge then as adults. So a significant part of their life is actually spent in water. And I think Praveen Kumar made the statement that water science is place-based science. And when you think about what's happening in the water of any individual place, that's also what's going on with the mosquitoes in that place. That there's actually something like 3,500 named species of mosquitoes. And fortunately, only a couple hundred of them actually like to bite us, and only a subset of those is going to transmit disease. But it's a very efficient way that diseases are transmitted. So the water part of the mosquito's life cycle is this larval stage. And so here's a few pictures of some of the kinds of places where mosquitoes can breed. Now this is actually just a really small subsection, and it tends to be toward the urban side, which is where I do my work. So you see some urban catch basins there, which are actually pictures from Chicago. And in the base of that catch basin, there's this sump, and down there's some stagnant water, and it just happens to be the place where the Culex mosquito that carries West Nile really likes to breed. So when we go and dip a scoop of water out, we almost only see Culex mosquitoes, and we usually do see mosquitoes. On the lower left side there, that's a picture from Colombo, Sri Lanka, and it's a part of a neighborhood that's had a lot of dengue. Now, in fact, any of the pictures that we've seen of all those different kinds of water, from irrigation, from swamps, from lakes, any one of those could equally be a place where mosquitoes could breed. The ones in cities actually tend to get a little more attention because those are the ones that are going to threaten human life, because that's where people also are. But that's certainly the case, is that any place there's water, you'll find mosquitoes. So getting now at how public health has addressed mosquito problems. So we as humans have been for centuries dealing with the problem of mosquitoes. Sometimes it's a pest problem, and only more recently have we realized that they actually carry a disease as well. So public health is what we do as a society collectively to ensure conditions in which people can be healthy. I think that's a nice definition of public health. And I'd like to then look at these four different historical phases, especially the first three are the historical side, and think about how mosquitoes were handled, or how mosquito-borne diseases were handled in each of these. So if we go back to the 1840s to 1870s, this is when the miasmic theory of disease was still in play. This goes back to the Greeks on through Middle Ages, that the idea was that the air somehow caused diseases. And so Edwin Chadwick was a particularly strong voice in what's called the sanitary movement. And we see this newspaper clipping here from, this is actually a little later than this time period, but this is from early 1900s, and it talks about the 19th Ward in Chicago, and you see filthy alleys, dirty streets, impure water, unwholesome foodstuffs. And then you'll notice that it mentions typhoid fever and malaria. Well, typhoid is actually a bacterial illness and would be carried by water. Malaria actually wouldn't necessarily happen because something is filthy or dirty. So what this miasma theory was, that somehow in the air you would become ill because of things that didn't smell good. So from a water perspective, this did give an incentive to clean up sewers and to try to clean up water. So for example, cholera in London was cleaned up partly without the real knowledge of exactly how it was being transmitted. On the negative side, this same set of people were promoting a certain kind of social Darwinism and some pseudoscience. So Calcutta and London were actually the two major cities of the time. And in fact, cholera came from Calcutta to London because of all the movement back and forth between the two places. And so there was a movement here where the attempt to clean up the city was also an attempt to control certain populations. So you'd have like white town and black town, and you'd have segregation. And so sometimes even the name malaria means bad air, and that was because the idea was that somehow the air was bad, that was why people were becoming ill. And even large avenues, which happened to also be good for the military, would be put through slum areas because they want to clear the air out. So there was this mix of kind of social control and pseudoscience that got mixed in because there was not an appreciation really for where these diseases were really coming from, and they were associated with things that are dirty. So not to belabor this too much, but when we do our work, even in suburban Chicago, we notice people can be really sensitive about the fact, oh, did you find mosquitoes around my house? And we're always like saying, oh, your house is really, very nice. You really can't help it if you have a few mosquitoes. So then we started scientists were looking more closely at what really is causing diseases. And so we move into this next era where this is the point where the actual parasite that causes malaria was identified by Alphonse Laveran in 1878 in Algeria. So he was actually able to see this through a microscope. And then Sir Ronald Ross in India, actually, just about a decade later or two, he then was able to show that it was the Anopheles mosquito and was carrying these. Now, if you read this particular clippings here, we can now see that they've now jumped to the point where, well, now we've got it figured out. These malarious fevers will now disappear because we've figured out what the parasite is, and it doesn't look like it'll be all that difficult, right? So that was kind of the attitude, is once we've identified what's causing this, now we can get onto it, and now it's people have to be clean and reduce contagion because now we know what it is that's causing this. Well, the fact is that malaria continued on as a real problem, and especially during the wars that took place in tropical areas. And so the next period here we have is the therapeutic period, where we've discovered antibiotics. Smallpox has being eradicated during this period. And it was also a time when pesticides, insecticides, really came to the forefront of being able to replace just prevention. So instead, they say, instead of having citronella and smudge fires, now we have the WPA workers out there under scientific direction in Illinois were removing mosquitoes, or draining areas where the mosquitoes were breeding. Now, unfortunately, the kinds of things that were being used in the waters at the time included this lovely chemical here called Paris green, which I looked up after I saw it on an early educational video that I saw. I said, what's Paris green? Well, it's arsenic, basically. And so all these workers were in Brazil in the 1940s. So yeah, we conquered yellow fever, but we also put large amounts of arsenic, and the workers who actually were out there distributing that were totally unprotected and were also affected by this. So DDT was used to kill adult mosquitoes. This Paris green was being put into water in order to kill the larval mosquitoes. And then we got organized. So we had large-scale regional water projects. So the Tennessee Valley Authority actually had a malaria component. They were testing people for malaria and checking to see if the number of infected people was going down. Also, they found that by varying the water level with the dams, they were able to prevent the mosquitoes from breeding as effectively. The Civilian Conservation Corps was involved with a lot of drainage projects. And this is also when we started seeing mosquito abatement districts. So mosquito abatement districts were set up specifically, for example, in Illinois in the early 1900s to both gather tax money and also to address this problem of mosquitoes and improve health. So all these things actually helped. And this graph is illustrative of the fact that in the United States between 1900 and 1980, that line that you see there going down is the mortality per 100,000 people. So in the course of our better understanding of disease agents and attacking it with some things that we sort of wish we hadn't used quite as much of, but we still used them, and antibiotics, and also that big spike there is Spanish influenza. You can really see the dramatic number of people who were killed from that. So then we're into our new public health, which is kind of the 1970s to the current time. And here we're looking at a more holistic view of health. And so I actually like this view. However, I have to also say that it's been a bit since about the 1970s or 80s that infectious diseases kind of got a foothold again and are coming back. And so this smaller graph on that first one, you can't see it at the scale in the big graph, but actually in between 1980 and 1990, there was a 58% increase, or 92, in infectious diseases. Now some of this is the United States that we're talking about, and some of that was AIDS. So we're seeing that as well. But across the world, in fact, a lot of the emerging infectious diseases have increased over time. So these graphs all are showing from 1940 up to about 2000. I know the dates are too small to read probably from where you are. In the lower right side here, this is the vector-borne disease. So the white parts of each of those graphs is showing the percentage of emerging infectious diseases in these different time periods that are vector-borne. So this is the graph that really made me recently, in the last, say, 5 years, kind of stand up and take notice that it really is an increase in dengue across the world. So this is showing the number of cases of dengue and the number of countries. So it's not just the number of cases, it's the number of places where we see dengue increasing in these last 60 years or so. And then dengue also has multiple serotypes, and the number of different serotypes has been spreading. And when you have more than one serotype circulating at the same time, we end up with worse outcomes sometimes in terms of the severity of the infection. So these maps start from 1943 in the upper left and then go down to the current time, 2000 to 2013. So we can see from that upper left moving down, and then the second column represents since 1980 to the present, that we have seen this, we've stopped using DDT, we stopped using the Paris green, but we haven't really replaced it as well as we need to in order to control these kinds of situations. Chikungunya was one that's come up just recently, first in the Indian Ocean and now more recently in the Caribbean, carried by mosquitoes. And it's carried by actually the same mosquito vectors as the dengue. This just shows us that malaria is still going strong, especially in the tropical areas. So I think hope I've made the case that we haven't always handled mosquito-borne diseases that well in the past, and at the same time we have made them decline, but now we're seeing a increase in these. So now how can we have a sustainable response to this, and also what is the role of the water management side of things? I've done a lot of work with West Nile virus, and so I can speak to that in the most detail. And you'll see from this upper left graph here, this is showing West Nile virus in the United States between 2002 and 2012. And we can see that it fluctuates from year to year. And one of the things that I've observed both in Illinois as well as in the United States, it's weather-based, that some years are better than others, and it's because of the water. And it has to do with the, sorry, I keep thinking I'm going to change this out, but he's looking kind of young there. So for those of you who don't know, the man there is our currently incarcerated governor. So the thing about the virus cycle is that really it's between birds and mosquitoes. And so that's called what we call an alternate host. And that affects what we would do to address this. And these are the kind of neighborhoods that we've been working in over the years looking at West Nile virus. So here's a model where I have put human infection here in the middle. And each of these arrows actually has a polarity. It has a positive or a negative to indicate whether or not it's something that would increase the thing that it's pointing to or decrease the thing that it's pointing to. And so we have over here some individual factors. These are things like whether or not somebody uses personal protection, what their housing is like, and then how much they're outside during the period when mosquitoes are actually active. And then I have water management at the micro scale. And this is where people can go out and dump the water out of the things that are in their yard, or they are making their own individual decisions. The red area, or the red variables there, those are all the biological part of the system. And then down here we have the social, or the parts that are done more at a municipal or regional level. And so here you can see that there's this larval ovipositing sites. Actually, I should have probably left that one out of that particular section. And that's where, depending on how many of those sites there are, then you are going to have more or fewer of those larval mosquitoes, and then some of those are going to emerge as adults. Some of those adults then will become infectious if they have a reservoir host that they've been infected by. So that's what that upper middle part is. Now, if there was no infectious reservoir host and all this was by humans, then the more human infections that we had, that loop would have gone around then between infectious mosquitoes and human infection. So by using a model like this, we can see that the causal relationships among all these things indicates that some of the water part, like how we're going to manage water at a city, how do we handle stormwater, what are the implications of flooding, And then also that rainfall and temperature here are interrelated to each other as well as to a lot of other things. So if there's a high temperature, people may go outdoors more or less depending on how hot it is, et cetera. So these things are all related, and so depending on which endpoint we choose, we'd have a different approach to this. So if our endpoint was infectious mosquitoes, our causal relationships may look something like this. These don't have the positive and negative. If our endpoint is the larval ovipositing sites and we want to try to control those, then we start seeing where the water management at these macro scale and micro scale come into play. And then with human infection, actually on this particular graph, the water doesn't actually ever show up, but we know that it's very central. So I think it's sometimes hard to see these relationships for how important they are because they're indirect, and although they are fundamental. So the iSEE has recently funded a new research theme, and I'm just putting a little plug up here for us. Brian Allen is the lead of this, and I'm one of the co-PIs along with others who are here in the room. And so we're looking at the effect of green infrastructure in particular as people are making changes about how stormwater is handled, particularly in Chicago first, but throughout other places as well. And then microbial engineering to think about the water chemistry and how that relates to the ability of mosquitoes to be successful in reproduction. So finally, the challenges of interdisciplinary work. I have a couple of really simple graphs here, and this one, I'd only put civil engineering, public health, and entomology here, but some of the business people have this phrase of what's in the white areas between these things. So the university is organized according to certain disciplines, but if we organize according to a problem, in our case to reduce mosquito-borne illnesses, then we can start finding ways that different groups contribute but aren't necessarily going to have the whole solution. And so I think that's one of our challenges, and these complex problems where we have we've seen the megacities issues, the fact that now many mosquitoes have developed resistance to insecticides. In some places we have breakdown of public health infrastructure. We saw what happened with Ebola just very recently, that wasn't just because of the severity of the illness, it was also because public health infrastructure had just broken down. And then question of funding. So this actually was an editorial in the Chicago Tribune, and I feel a little smug about it because it came in June of 2012, just before the big outbreak. So we'd had several years of no outbreaks. And so people were saying, oh, we're spending all this money, mosquitoes are ruthless and formidable. But no, they said they are not ruthless and formidable. We don't need to be fighting them so much. And that really it's all about just wanting to have more government. So I think both educating the public about the importance of mosquito-borne illnesses, and then what we can learn from a place like West Nile, a place like Chicago, looking at West Nile, where we have a lot of data. We also need to think about how to apply those same principles or these same modeling ideas and interdisciplinary work to other places where the data is not as rich, but the problems are even bigger. So thank you.
So I think we only have one mic there to pass around. I'll just kind of stand in the middle, and then as questions come, I can pass the mic from table to table. Does anybody have questions for any of our speakers? Please. You go ahead and use the mic.
Sorry, I'll just jump ahead. So this is a question from Marilyn, and
I'm not sure it's on.
Okay.
Or maybe you're just tall.
All right, got the beep there. Question for Marilyn. You gave us a bit of a teaser. Can you tell us wetlands, green infrastructure, the kinds of things that we need to be aware of relative to we're creating a nice natural environment perhaps for mosquitoes and other things to grow? Is that a factor? Are there ways to control that and minimize that issue?
So you're asking about green infrastructure in particular, or just generally about? Right. So I I would say that that's an area that hasn't been addressed very well yet, but I think there's some indication that it could improve the situation. But it also depends on the mosquito species. And so I think that you have to look at things across different places, because some mosquitoes are going to prefer certain kinds of environments. Others are going to have preferences for maybe running water versus stagnant water, organically enriched water versus clear water. So I think that what we have to do in that area is to find ways to set up experiments, both in the lab and natural experiments, in order to really find what are these fundamental pieces. Like, a lot of it probably doesn't matter that much. We can probably live with certain things, in a variety of ways, but to try to find those tipping points, or those points where it actually does make a difference. So I think that is very much what the iSEE research theme is about. So I hope, in a few years there will be some more answers to some of those specifics.
Another question? Anybody want to step up to the mic? Either mic, please.
I have one question for Marilyn as well. I live in Atlanta, where lots of mosquitoes. Seems they recommend to having bats. I mentioned this because that seemed to be a biological way of control mosquito population. Is that a really effective way on the scale you're discussing? And
I think there's no one thing that will control mosquitoes, but certainly bats are a good thing overall. I've seen different views of that. Not many people have done a lot of empirical work to say you can really tell the difference in how many mosquitoes there are before or after bats. But certainly when you look at how many mosquitoes a bat is capable of actually consuming, and there are other predators of mosquitoes as well. And so I think that is one where you're not going to solve it all by just having bats. And I think it's trying to think of one thing that will be the magic bullet is maybe our mistake. Yeah, but bats certainly would be good, but they probably wouldn't be sufficient.
I hail from Minnesota, where the mosquito is the state bird. And so I've heard that Mayo left either Indiana or Illinois to go to Minnesota to escape, malaria. And I wondered if you could confirm that or not. But is it just that we've somehow managed to deal with the particular type of mosquitoes in the Midwest and the U.S. that carry malaria? Because we sure have plenty of mosquitoes. Come to Minnesota if you need some mosquitoes. Thanks.
Right. Yeah, we really don't have very many of those at all. So if the Anopheles, actually, I'm not a mosquito expert, so I'm sitting here thinking you're asking me all these questions about mosquitoes, and I don't know if Juma's in the room, but it's one of my. And then Brian Allen also has got some entomology background. So each mosquito species is just so different. So I'm a geographer. I've learned quite a bit about Culex pipiens and Culex restuans because they carry West Nile virus. And whenever I've been interviewed for anything, someone always asks, why is it my wife gets bit by mosquitoes and I don't? Or, and I think those things are just so different for mosquitoes. It's really quite a complex system, and I think that's what you can't underestimate. If you're going to do a model of a mosquito, you can't just put mosquito in there. It's got to be a particular species, and it even almost has to be in a particular location, because the same species of mosquito may not be behaving or reproducing at the population level, may not be the same. So.
Hi, I'm from Brazil, and mosquitoes are a huge problem there, especially dengue, Aedes aegypti, so it's really complicated, yeah. And in the university I studied, ESALC, I don't know if you're aware about that, but they are releasing genetically modified mosquitoes there so they could stop reproducing. Yeah. So what's your opinion about that? Because they are having good results about this, but it's very in the beginning. So it's really complicated to deal with that now, yeah?
No, I think that's a very promising area, definitely. And there are some other aspects, like Wolbachia is another kind of a biological aspect of finding that you can infect mosquitoes that would carry dengue but don't carry it. And so I think this is one of the things the Gates Foundation has actually been pretty effective at, is trying to find some of these different ways of addressing mosquito problems that aren't necessarily related to eradication or even that as the goal, but try to just neuter them or to make them so that they're not able to carry the pathogens that are causing the problem.
Aparna, go ahead.
So I guess, so my question is from, for data, so for you. Basically, I was, so as an economics student, I felt like it's really great to think from a little bit like socio-economic perspective. So your data, is it like some kind of administrative data, or can you please tell us a little more about the data set? So it's like, can you define like which group of people are more vulnerable than, like, say, is it some kind of age group or gender or occupation? And actually, like public hospitals or private hospitals, what kind of hospitals are mainly taking all this? You know the background what I'm talking about. So I guess that interrelations will be very important in this. That you are seen from an engineering perspective, I can understand. I guess it will be also interesting to think.
Thank you. So the data that we are looking at is the number of people visiting the hospital. And when they are admitted, they are coming for a diarrheal symptom. But it can be cholera, it can be other diarrheal diseases as well. So everybody who is admitted then goes through a statistical sample, goes through the actual biological test, the pathological test, to make sure that how many are actually having cholera within them, the bacteria within them. When they're also admitted, the other information that you are looking for is also recorded. Their background, their age, male or female, the economic sector that they are from, and all that. And ICDDRB, the institution that I was talking about, they are actually doing a great job at that. So for the last 30 years, they have developed this huge database of this data set. So economists, I know of some who are actually looking at that side of the data, but the issue, I think, the difference is that that is does not cover. I would say that data set does not capture exactly what environmental conditions they're exposed to. So it is, if you look at the data, I have looked at the data, and in general, it can be estimated that they are from an, of course, economically poor neighborhood, and typically from surveys it is found out that the slum areas are typically the places where these patients are coming from, and Dhaka has a lot of them. So it is primarily, it is swamped with patients from those areas. However, it is not, there is that assumption there that they are, that the data set that we have is well represented in terms of the distribution of social and economic indicators. And it is also presumed that the people who has better economic opportunities or means, they will go to probably a better hospital, or they will seek better health care. So primarily, the government hospitals, as you probably know, are typically catering to the person who are at the bottom of the economic ladder. And ICDDRB is probably has a mix, because they are the specialist in diarrheal diseases. So in terms of extreme cases, I'm sure they will see some people from upper or middle class households as well. But as far as I know, it is primarily this other subset of the society, and that data is recorded. So economists, if they want to study the links and relationships between their economic status and the services they have, that opportunity is there. But it is only ICDRB that has the capability to diagnose a people who has the cholera disease. The government hospitals would just record that as a diarrheal case. They would not know whether it's cholera, whether it's rotavirus or something else. So there comes the limitations of data. There are only the main hospital, which has a 30-year data set that I showed, and there are about 5 regional surveillance centers that has a shorter period, about 5 to 7 years of data. And this is the best case scenario of the whole world. So you can imagine the situation here.
My question is for Professor Knapp. The beautiful grassland ecosystem you showed us is, in my understanding, is that it is a heavily managed ecosystem, managed with fire for grazing. And your experiment, the ramp experiment, very elegant 15-year experiment, didn't include a disturbance regime. And so how do you think rainfall intensification is going to interact with the disturbance regime, fire as a management tool, and would we expect the same kind of decreases in productivity with changes in rainfall intensity under a disturbance regime?
So I always teach my students to compliment the question asker by saying great question. In this case, I'm going to say terrible question, Evan, because that's a really hard question, right? So one of the trade-offs we all deal with when we do these small-scale experiments is we can't include the large-scale disturbances that might perhaps even overwhelm them. Now, that experiment was burned, so we did include that particular experiment. We haven't done it in a non-burn situation either, for example. And we can try and model, right, how canopy removal and increased nitrogen availability might influence that. But what we can't capture is the spatial variability as well. And I think what we've learned, and we've studied bison grazing and cattle grazing in these grasslands for years, is that spatial variability can be just as important as anything else with regard to those disturbances. And so it's a tremendous limitation, right, to any of these studies, to any experiment that we do, whether it's CO2, temperature, water, whatever it is, it's always going to be a limitation, and we can only include
doing things differently now in the field because of intensified. So here we're seeing changes in planting dates because of spring intensification of rainfall. Are ranchers doing different stuff because of can they get in the field to burn when they burn? I mean, I just don't know how that system's managed.
Yeah, so it is being managed differently now, but not for reasons of climate change, right? They haven't responded yet to that. In that part of the world, what they're responding to is air quality issues. So the cities in the region now are threatening lawsuits against the ranchers because the air quality is going down and they're failing to meet the standards in their cities. This is a real problem for the preservation of grasslands because fire is required to maintain them as grasslands, and yet the cities are all claiming that they don't want them to burn anymore as a result. So we haven't seen any evidence that the ranchers are changing their management yet, but it doesn't mean that they won't have to in the future.
Okay, Brian, and then you.
First off, thank you all for your time today. I think I speak for a lot of us when I say it goes well received, so thank you for sharing. My question is for Alan as well, I guess I'll preface it by saying I spent 30 years of my life in Colorado and 13 of that in Fort Collins and LaPorte, so it's good to see a face around here. Matter of fact, my wife loved it so much she stayed there, so that's sad, but anyway. My question, my question, I guess, relates to these drought experiments in the grasslands and relevant anyway with the ecosystem service, the effect on the ecosystem services themselves. You spoke mostly about soil moistures and grassland productivity or the effect on these grasslands with grazing. Can you speak more about the effect of additional services provided by these grassland experiments that you guys had? So.
Sure, thanks. There are, by the way, great question. There's a number of additional services we could talk about. Carbon sequestration below ground, for example. The aesthetic ecosystem service of biodiversity would be another one. In fact, let's talk about that one, since that's oftentimes what a lot of people appreciate in grasslands as well. So the ranchers, again, are going to be primarily looking at the grasses and are interested in the grasses. And it turns out that from their perspective, severe drought in these grasslands actually increases grass cover. So if you go through a long-term pattern of more and more severe droughts over time, you're actually likely to lose diversity in the system, because it's the C3 forbs, the flowering plants, that will disappear, and the grasses will actually become relatively more plentiful over time. When we started this experiment with the changes in rainfall regimes, one of our key predictions, which as often is the case didn't come true, is that we thought we would also change not only the variability in soil moisture by changing the size of events and the number of events, but the depth distribution of soil moisture. So the big events would go deeper into the soil. The grasses tend to be more shallow rooted. The forbs, which are the diverse plant group in the prairie, tend to be deeper rooted. And so we thought we might actually see the forbs increase relative to the grasses as a result of this change in rainfall patterns. So 15 years have passed, and we've seen no evidence of that at all. We've seen no impact on that particular ecosystem service. We've had students look below ground, looking to see if there perhaps deeper, a pattern of deeper rooting as a result of larger rains going deeper into the soil, longer dry periods in between dry the shallow soils out more, and so perhaps we'd see deeper rooting, and we'd see greater carbon sequestration or greater carbon content deeper in the soil as well. We've seen no evidence of that either. So for the most part, it's been neutral below ground, neutral in terms of diversity, but a decrease in forage production for the ranchers. But those are sort of the big three ecosystem services I can think of from that particular grassland.
I have a question to Jeff, and I learned a lot from your talk, enjoyed it very much. I think so far today, all of us almost except your presentation are dealing with food, water, energy, things that directly relevant to human, but yet these species, and human is one species in this biological evolution. In principle, this is just my guess, for well-educated people who know the importance of these species, perhaps in a general way, but not when it comes to food, water, energy, things directly related to human need. Where should we place the importance of biospecies, especially in the perhaps remote tropical area, remote from us? And where this how can we let people appreciate the importance of this, and where should we put this global environmental issue in the equation, in the overall equation for human to address really this global changing?
I don't know whether that's a difficult question or a good question or whatever, but I know I'm not going to be able to answer it very quickly. But I mean, this gets into one's philosophy about whether you care about biodiversity and whatnot. But if you get very practical about biodiversity, we depend on biodiversity. If those tropical forests start to undergo a change point to convert to savanna forests, the amount of carbon that's released into the atmosphere is going to be phenomenal. Okay, so that's going to affect everybody. Conservation biologists go on and on about why we need biodiversity. Whether you want to talk about drugs for cancer or whatnot that you get from bioprospecting, whether it's just cultural values. I mean, I didn't talk at all about if in the Amazon basin, the cultural displacement of indigenous people there is going to be really, really important, okay? And so I didn't talk at all about that, but I think that's a people issue as well. So where you place that, I don't think we can have agroecology without biodiversity. I mean, I think farmers were the first ecologists, and if we have a complete change point of biological systems at these latitudes, it's going to have a lot of effect on society. It's going to have a lot of effect on food production, soil health, nutrient regeneration, whatnot. So, you can bring up case histories of where things work better with biodiversity and where they don't. Now, in the case of birds themselves, people have done lots of experiments where, like in cacao plantations, and I'm a big fan of chocolate, so cacao is important to me. And if you take the birds away, then all the herbivorous insects really nail the cacao plants a lot more. So even things like insectivorous birds or bats or whatever can provide that kind of service. So it gets into what you care about, but it also gets into a real practical value. And if half the world's biodiversity resides at tropical latitudes, we're going to really have to pay attention to that. So,
one more question? Organizer gets one more question.
I have a question for Professor Brawn. So your argument that the tropics, very, very important ecosystem from the global carbon cycle perspective, is particularly vulnerable to very small changes in precipitation, is based on the argument that stability has selected for life history traits that don't deal well with variance. Is that more or less what you got? And so I was thinking about that, and I thought, well, if that's true, then the converse ought to be true, that in highly variable environments, you ought to have life history traits that are well adapted to variance, and they might be able to do a little better with intermittent extreme events. And then I was thinking about the western United States, and the most catastrophic collapse we've had in a forest ecosystem, if you can call it a forest ecosystem in this country, has been the loss of the pinyon forests out west. And so here's a system that should be very adapted to strong dynamics and precipitation regime, yet proved to be very vulnerable. Doesn't this argue against your hypothesis?
Well, it doesn't argue against it. It's a counterexample. And pinyon pines, I mean, if you look at the paleoecology records, there's been other episodes of pinyon pines coming and going. Having got my PhD with a guy that studied pinyon jays, he knows a lot about pinyon pines. So it's not unheard of. And the Ips bark beetles, yeah, they came through and they really did a number on the pinyon pines. That's a biological interaction. I didn't get into that as much. The pinyon pines are doing just fine with the dry conditions. So they had the physiological flexibility to withstand that. But then an enemy came in and took care of it. So that's a little bit of a different situation.
Trophic dynamic that did them in.
Right. So if you start to get into food web dynamics, then I'm not going to lay claim that this differential sensitivity to tropical. I mean, then you get into this whole thing about stability, diversity, and that's been raging for 40 years. So I'm not quite sure we can make too many statements on that. So, but that's a good point.
One last question here.
My question is Professor Jeffrey. My name is Edson from Brazil. I'm working with fertilizers, technology applied to fertilizers. My question is about, we know that fertilizers that contain nitrogen can release N2O, nitrous oxide, and affect the greenhouse effect. There's some data related to the cycles of dry and rain with these emissions of N2O that provide for fertilizers, and our opinion about the new technologies to coatage and inhibit this problem with nitrogen fertilizers.
Boy, that's out of my area. If Mark David was here, is Mark here? Help, Mark. Okay, well, I'm going to fire him. He's in my department. But so I really can't answer that question, and I don't want to venture. I don't even want to venture a guess on that. Whether tropical systems need the level of nitrogen supplements that we do here and the type of things that we grow there, that's an interesting question. I mean, phosphorus in natural systems here, phosphorus is limiting, it's far more limiting than nitrogen is in tropical systems. So, but where you get into getting into what you asked about, I just have to, no say. So.
Thank you. Well, I would just want to take the because I'm in the middle here, I want to say two things. First, your question about green infrastructure. I did want to say the people who design green infrastructure for urban areas, things like rain barrels and rain gardens and bioswales, those are designed very carefully not to foster mosquitoes because they're really concerned about that. Natural wetlands, totally different story. But if you see a rain garden, don't worry about mosquitoes because they're designed to infiltrate too quickly for the larvae to hatch. And then I just want to say that Fort Collins isn't the only place that has brew pubs. So those of you who are in town visiting, presumably they're not going to keep you busy all night. So in Champaign, there are a couple of nice places that you can go, and Champaign-Urbana has a good scene like Fort Collins. Okay, thanks all. Time for a coffee break.